Good afternoon, Year 4, and welcome to your IPC lesson. We're actually running it, although it's Miss Flukes and myself will be making a video each, a lesson part each for this week. They are actually linked together. So as I mentioned to some of my children last week on the catch-up chats, there isn't a great deal of writing to do this week, so that's quite nice. You've got a bit of listening to do and lots of making and artwork. Okay, so we're going to have a look at the learning intention. Now, what we're trying to do, we've got two learning intentions this week. They are both historical, so you're both of the objectives are linking to ancient Egypt. One of them will be art-based because you're going to be designing and making your own thing at the end of the session. Okay, so our intention today is to know who the pharaoh was in Egypt. Okay, and it's an unusual word, pharaoh, as you can see, spelt very unusually. And the second part is to design a cartouche. And we'll talk about what a cartouche is as we move through the lesson. But first of all, what I want you to do very quickly with the person next to you, whether that's in school or whether that's at home, who was the pharaoh? Who was the pharaoh in ancient Egypt? Press pause now and press play when you're ready to come back. Okay, well, the pharaoh was the most important and powerful person in Egypt. Okay, he was the political and religious leader, so he was politically in charge. He decided what happened in the country and who did what, but also he controlled religion as well. Now it says there the people of Egypt considered the pharaoh to be half man, half god. So in terms of ancient Egypt, and we will talk about the gods a bit later on, he was considered to be more than just a man. He was like a semi-god, a demigod to them. And I'm sure most of you will be saying that the pharaoh was a king, and you're kind of right, absolutely right. But kind of the pharaoh did everything. He was king, he was prime minister, he was president, he was the pope, he was everybody all rolled into one. Okay, so he was the supreme power in the country. To begin with, ancient Egypt was actually split into two kingdoms. You had the upper kingdom and the lower kingdom. And those two kingdoms had two different rulers, two kings. At that point, they weren't called pharaohs, they were kings. Now, somebody called, there was the very first Egyptian pharaoh was somebody called Narmer. Okay, and he's quite important in ancient Egyptian history because he came and conquered. Both parts of Egypt, and what he actually did was put both of them together. Okay, so he's always remembered as being very important because he became the first Egyptian pharaoh. He was the first king of both Upper and Lower Egypt. And what he was able to do then, he was able to take both of the crowns. So you can see that you've got the ancient Egyptians, the two kings, the upper and lower kingdom, they had two crowns. One was called the white crown, one was called the red crown. The white crown was from Upper Egypt and the red crown was from Lower Egypt. And Narmer was the first pharaoh to put both crowns together. So if you look in this picture here, this is what we know, or if we look at ancient Egyptian art, that's what the pharaoh looks like. Okay, that's what his crown looks like. Well, it's a mixture of these two crowns. One of the other pharaohs that I've just picked out for us to have a little look at is Ramesses the Great. Okay, now Ramesses the Great was actually Ramesses II, and he led the Egyptian army against lots of different enemies in his time, including the Hittites, the Syrians, the Libyans, and the Nubians. And what he did was he really expanded the Egyptian empire. He secured its borders. He made sure that Egypt was safe and that nobody could come and conquer it. And he was also known as a great builder. Lots of the Egyptian temples and artifacts that we still see in ancient Egypt today, which of course are 4,000 years old, which is amazing. You think all these things were being carved that long ago. probably when in England we were still living in huts and mud huts and things like that. So, you know, the ancient Egyptians were ahead of their time. And Ramesses II was one of the most amazing um, builders of all. And he's remembered because he lived to be over 90 years old. Okay. And that was really old for an ancient Egyptian. People back in ancient times didn't live as long as they do today. They would be lucky if they lived sort of into their 40s and 50s. So for somebody to live to 90, that really cemented his place as being something special. And the Egyptian people considered him to be this half god. And to their mind, being able to live to 90 years of age was a really good way of proving it. Okay, there weren't that many Egyptian pharaohs that were women. Nefertiti was one of the most important, but probably one of the most well-known today, ones that we tend to know or hear of today, was Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was the Egyptian pharaoh towards the end of the Egyptian empire, towards the very end. At this point, when their civilization was perhaps not as powerful as it used to be, the Romans had taken over, and the Romans had become the all-powerful empire of the world. They conquered Egypt, they took over Egypt, but they left the pharaoh in charge. He just had to follow their orders, and Egypt became really important to Rome because, you know, if you imagine, the Roman Empire was huge, and feeding the Roman Empire was really difficult. So the Romans relied on Egypt to supply it with grain, to supply it with food. You can see a little picture here of Cleopatra. She was pharaoh at the time of Julius Caesar, who you might have heard of. And we always remember she's quite famous for having this sort of Egyptian haircut like this that lots of the ladies wore at the time. And she was the last pharaoh. After her, there were no more pharaohs. Probably one of the most famous pharaohs of all of ancient Egypt is, and you might have heard of this particular pharaoh, was Tutankhamun. Now, Tutankhamun was he was known as the Boy King. Evidence suggests that he died at around the age of 17, so he wasn't very old. And Tutankhamun wasn't one of the most powerful pharaohs. He wasn't one of the greatest pharaohs in Egypt. He's famous today because we found his treasure. Now, pharaohs were always buried with their most precious treasures, and the problem is for people today to try, you know, we haven't recovered much of that treasure. It hasn't been found. Lots of grave robbers robbed the tombs of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. But Tutankhamun's tomb was overlooked by the grave robbers. So just about 100 years ago, a man called Howard Carter, who was a very famous archaeologist, he discovered Tutankhamun's tomb complete with all its treasure. So today in ancient Egypt, a lot of the museums, certainly the National Museum in Cairo, is full of Tutankhamun's treasure from his grave, which is really precious, lots of gold. And you can see in the picture here, this is the death mask that was worn by Tutankhamun. It's made of solid gold, and it is absolutely priceless. It's kept in a special room in the National Museum in Cairo, and you're not even allowed to take photographs of it. Here's some of the treasure that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and you can see these are the mummy cases. And what happened with these is Tutankhamun was on the inner one, but they gradually, it's a bit like a Russian doll, they got there were lots and lots and lots of mummy cases, one inside the other, until you got to the final case. Here again is his death mask, and that's a famous image that you do see quite a lot when you're looking at things to do with ancient Egypt. So where did the pharaohs live? Well, in ancient Egypt, different pharaohs at different points of the civilization lived in different places. There was a place called Karnak that was very important. Lots of temples were in Karnak, so very important buildings were there. Most of the pharaohs lived in a place called Memphis, okay? Not to be confused with the Memphis in America. which is named after the ancient capital of ancient Egypt. Today in Egypt, the capital city is Cairo, and that's where most of the government buildings are. But Cairo wasn't as important back in the time of ancient Egypt. It's a modern city. The one thing that is in Cairo that dates back to ancient times, though, are the Giza pyramids, the big pyramids that we see on television and in books. They are just outside of Cairo. Okay, so we need to move into the second part of the session, the bit that you'll enjoy. And it says there, what is a cartouche? Okay, well, all of the pharaohs had their own cartouche. It was a little bit like a signature. Okay, it was something that symbolized every pharaoh had a different one. And it was used to seal important things. Now, it could be used like documents. Okay, so it could be the Pharaoh would have had a seal, and he would have, if he, instead of having an envelope that he could seal up, he might have a scroll. He might put a blob of wax on it, hot wax, and then his seal, the cartouche, would seal it down. King Tutankhamun, when he was discovered, his tomb was completely sealed, and all of the cement, the plaster that sealed that tomb, was all imprinted with Tutankhamun's cartouche. And that proved that we knew that the tomb hadn't been disturbed for thousands of years. Now, the cartouches usually had something on them that was important to the pharaoh. So this is part of Tutankhamun's cartouche, and you can see the sun. The round disc there is the sun. The sun was really important to the ancient Egyptians. They worshipped it. They had a sun god called Ra. So that doesn't surprise me that Tutankhamun had that on his cartouche. The other major bit on his cartouche there is the scarab beetle. Now, again, the scarab beetle, the blue scarab, was very important to the ancient Egyptians. So again, it doesn't surprise me that Tutankhamun had that as part of his cartouche. You can see here, this is Tutankhamun's cartouche. And as I said, it was used to seal his tomb to protect it from the grave robbers. So one side of his cartouche, one part of his cartouche there, you've got the sun and the scarab. Okay, and this part here represents the River Nile. And the other part here is Tutankhamun's name in hieroglyphics in ancient Egyptian. Now, each of these pictures represents a letter, and you're going to find out a little bit more about that with Miss Flukes later on in the week. Okay. So we're now going to come to your independent task today. Now, what I want you to know, I want you to try and do, is design your own cartouche. So you've seen Tutankhamun's. We're going to be asking you to include on your cartouche symbols that are really important to you. So it might be that you love reading books. So part of your cartouche might be a symbol for a book. You might enjoy playing football. So one of them might be a ball. You might enjoy roller skating. So you might have a roller skate. So it's got to be something that's important to you. It could be a picture of your dog. It could be, either way, you've got to come up with things and think about things that are really important to you. Now, when you design, you can use paint, pencils, pens, crayons. In fact, you can use anything that you like. We're not going to limit you on this. You can use whatever you've got hanging around at home to make this. And what I've done, attached to on the school website and on Microsoft Teams, I've put a template up there, a suggested template of something that you could use. But you don't obviously have to download and use that. It's just there to show you the sort of thing that I'm looking for. And you can actually design your own if you want to, your own or draw your own shape if you want to onto paper. Okay, so all that remains for me to say is happy designing, and I look forward to seeing some of these cartouches. Take care. Bye bye.